I think that's what so many people fear about the interview is they think, well, I'm going to fumble this. Welcome back to the Americans in Paris. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today I'm going to continue discussing my application for citizenship. Last recording, I talked about just some of the paperwork, birth certificates, translations, etc. And there was a link to that in the description of the video, the article that was based off. There'll be an article linked in today's description as well, which was talking about interview prep. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. You will get an interview. But before that, you have to have basically a notice that your dossier has been accepted. And this comes in two parts. The first is a confirmation de dépôt, which is simply, we have received your paperwork. This isn't certified that the paperwork is good or complete, but it just means everything that we've asked you to upload, it seems you have uploaded it. So now we're going to check it. And so what they do is the file now goes to somebody who checks to make sure that, at least on first glance, keep in mind the dossier is going to be checked many, many times by many, many people, but this is just a first glance. This is supposed to be an upload of a birth certificate. They look over, is this a birth certificate? Is it in French, etc.? And they go through that. And once that is done, you will get a récépissé de complétude, which means we are certain that this is complete. But between those two, you may get a notice that you need other things. And so I got a notice after my confirmation de dépôt, I think a couple months later, in which they asked for more financials for my French business. So I had given them the tax returns, but they wanted the financials. I just talked to my accountant. I had him create a PDF with all of them together because there's only room to upload one file. The day after I uploaded it, I got a récépissé de complétude. So that was really the only thing that my file was waiting for. And then from there, I think probably seconds later, there was a convocation for my interview. From the time I got it to when the interview was a matter of weeks. So I think 5 or 6 weeks. That's when my interview prep triggered. The interview had been something in the future. I thought when I get a notice, I'll have 4 or 5 months potentially. And without urgency, I wasn't really going to start hitting the books to prepare for my interview. I was very fortunate in having a friend, she's French and she's a teacher, was able to interview me in a mock fashion for French nationality. And she had done some research on questions, and then I gave her all the research I had, which was years of collecting questions from Facebook groups. People would come back from their interview and they would type up the questions they remember being asked, and then we would source them, all of us who would be going through the process in the future. We would keep them, and I kept them in an Apple Note and broke them down into different categories. One level, you have to understand that you have been prepped to do this interview simply by living in France. The primary goal of the interviewer is to find out if you really live life in France or integrated with France and its values. And do you know a little bit about the country that you're hoping to become a citizen of? That first part is potentially the easiest part. If you have been living a life in France, you have French friends, you volunteer at some nonprofits, you vacation in different parts of the country, that will all come easy and naturally. You don't have to memorize that. That is there, that's natural. Secondly, if you have attained B1 French, and by the time you're watching this video, it may have already changed to B2, you have tested to B2 French, the language problem is not going to be a fear. I think that's what so many people fear about the interview is they think, well, I'm going to fumble this. But I say, if you have B1 French, you shouldn't be afraid. Obviously, there's a nervousness. I'm not going to say I wasn't nervous when I went to my interview, but that nervousness should not be about the language. It could be potentially about what I'm going to talk about now, historical part. I haven't introduced this yet. They are talking about potentially adding a test on history, a written test or some kind of oral test on history. That isn't in place now. But what is in place now is some questions you may be asked about the French government. How is the president elected? How is the Senate elected? How is the National Assembly elected? How long do they serve for? Who is a prime minister? Is the minister of the interior? I had to study some of those things because I'm not very political. Interestingly, when I was interviewed, I think the prime minister was a very short-serving prime minister, and he was prime minister for maybe a couple months, and then there was a new prime minister right after my interview. I spent time memorizing a bunch of ministers. I also remembered who the mayor of my arrondissement was. So I was prepared for the newer political questions, but I also am a great lover of French history, so I didn't have to do as much studying for the question that I was asked, which was name some important figures of French history and why they're significant. So I was able to talk about Clovis, Joan of Arc, Henry IV, King Louis IX, who was also a saint. That all came naturally. The part that I had to understand in terms of what France is asking for these days is about the Fifth Republic. And keep in mind, France has had 12 or 13 forms of government since America was founded, which is funny to think about given how ancient France is. This is the Fifth Republic, and there are certain, shall we say, Republican values which come along from the French Revolution. There are certain testing questions that you're asked, which are there to screen you. This was not something I had actually learned about before the interview, but there's effectively a screening on sexism, what they call homophobia, and racism. You're going to get one of these three questions, and how you answer, I think, will push your application one way or the other. So for example, the question I got was, how do you feel about the equality of men and women? I originally laughed when the interviewer asked me the question. She laughed a little bit too, because I think she thought I was surprised by the question because it didn't occur to me naturally. I said to her in French, I said, oh, I understand that this question may not be so obvious to people coming from different cultures. I talked about, yes, I believe in the equality of men and women, and that was that. Someone else I know had been asked about, do you believe in the right of homosexuals to marry? Another one was, how do you feel about security in France, which was apparently the racism question. There are three of these different questions floating around. You will probably be asked one of them, and they are supposed to detect your feelings on things, and whether you give an unacceptable answer to any of those questions will probably end your citizenship process right there. I had no problem saying that I believed in the equality of men and women, and so that was the end of that question for me. Realistically, the things that I had worried about, am I going to be able to name, 4 Moliere plays? I wasn't asked that sort of thing. Mountain ranges in France, name some rivers in France. I was ready with all of the geography. I had studied all of that. So my friend interviewed me back to back. So my interview was on a Thursday, so she interviewed me Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday night. We went and got a coffee, and then she just sort of bombarded me for about an hour, 90 minutes. And it was funny because other people would hear our conversation in French next to us, and they would realize, oh, he's prepping for his citizenship interview. And some people gave some encouragement, some people laughed at some of my answers. But ultimately, what I realized through that process of those mock interviews with her is that if you have been living life in France, you're prepared for 75% of the interview. The other 25% is really, I would say, nerdy history, geography, literature stuff, which is completely reasonable. If you want to be part of a country, you should know some basics about the country. It would be like becoming an English citizen and not knowing anything about Shakespeare, becoming an American citizen and not knowing who George Washington was. So in the same sense here, I was just asked to validate. It so happened that I happen to love French history, love French literature, and I've had a chance to know that on my own. But someone who hasn't, and you want to work towards citizenship one day, I would really encourage you to pick up some books. I used a Petit Larousse book, which was aimed, I think, at 7 and 8-year-olds in French, but it shows you different regions of France. It talks about different specialties, different parts of French history, and, was written for, well, maybe not 6 or 7, maybe an 11 or 12-year-old. But I was able to read it pretty easily because I can read me and Bébart, Martine, Tintin. That is my French level. I'm perfectly capable of that. Don't ask me about Victor Hugo French, but I use those books to review some of the holes in my French knowledge. And I would encourage you to do that too, just casually, so that way you don't feel like you're cramming for an exam. But ultimately, as I was going through the exam, I even had a notebook open to write down the questions she was asking me. It was so much easier going, I think, than I had built up in my mind. It lasted maybe about 30 or 45 minutes. At the end of it, she gave me effectively a contract stating, these are the responsibilities of French citizens. Do you agree? I had to sign it. Then she scanned it in to my dossier, and then she gave it back to me, and she said, we don't know how long this will take, but the file will be reviewed. And that was really the end of my part of the citizenship process. I had submitted a dossier on the interview, and now it was with the French authorities for them to decide what happened. How long after that? A few months after that, I got a decision, which I will share about in the next episode. I hope this gives you a better sense of what it is like to prepare for the interview, and then what the interview process was like. I alluded to the fact that the link in the description to interview prep, there also is a link. I'll also put it in the description, the interview itself, and I think I put in all of the questions that I was asked that I could remember, so you can have some reference. And I encourage you to do what I did. If you are prepping for an interview in the future, collect all the questions, treat it like a treasury, and then start to separate them. This is a question about history, this is a question about geography, this is a question about my personal life. And then you will come to this interview relaxed and treating it like just another part. Oh, you asked me for a birth certificate? Great. Oh, you asked me for an interview? Great. And that's how it should feel to you ultimately when you do this. As I said, in the next video, I'll tell you what happened. And until that time, à bientôt.